Hello and welcome to this episode of Shoulder to Shoulder, where we strive to grow in love of the Lord and each other. I'm Megan Silas.
And I'm Pam Marvin.
And we're so glad to be back with y'all today. And we just keep being on this roll where we've got one topic for one episode that leads to the next episode, leads to the next episode. So as we were discussing the last two episodes where we were getting into the topic of effeminacy and toxic femininity, we really came in onto this idea of discipline and what it means to be trained or train oneself in order to endure hard things, to be able to not be effeminate, but to be strong in what we are called to as servants of God. And so that's what we wanted to talk about today. All the ways that we receive or struggle to receive the discipline that God allows in our lives, and the way that we seek to discipline ourselves to grow in spirit of self-control.
Right. And the reason the topic came up so much is we see this as, lacking in our culture and something that has really waned throughout the decades or centuries in the United States, and a practical way to try and bring more order into our own lives. I'll be the first to say I need more discipline. And hopefully this will be an episode that helps to inspire people to increase discipline in their own lives.
So I think before we get too far into it, we maybe should kind of ask ourselves, when we say discipline, what are we talking about? What are we really thinking? Because I don't know about you, but when you first hear the word discipline, as a parent, my first thought is, okay, the things I do in my child's life to train them up to what is good. And it usually seems to have a negative connotation in the sense that you've done something wrong, so now you have to be disciplined to teach you that you did something wrong. And it really actually came up in the last episode because we were talking quite a bit about the Garden of Eden and about the fall, and about how because of the fall, there were consequences that God placed onto Adam and Eve as a result of their sin. So first of all, the most obvious one is they're going to die. So that's the big one. But the other one was that Adam was going to have to work and toil to feed himself, basically, and his family, and that the woman was going to have to endure the authority of the man and have pain in childbirth. So these are two disciplines that were given to the whole human race from the very beginning because of the fall. So God from the very beginning shows himself to be a father who says, you've done something wrong and there are going to be some consequences of your misbehavior. But the purpose of the discipline is not to injure. It's not to just make you feel bad, but it's to help you to grow into the rightly ordered person that you're meant to be. So that, I think, is the perfect example of how we can look at discipline as something that is imposed upon us, but it's only proper if its purpose is for our good.
Right. And when I think of discipline in this season of my life as an empty nester, I think of it kind of in a positive way of I am being more disciplined about going to sleep at night at the same time and waking up. So routine, to have a discipline of going to the gym and working out, going on my walks, eating properly, that kind of discipline that rightly orders my life, going to mass, going to confession, those kind of things. It's another way to look at a discipline. That's how I see it in my time of life.
Right. I think, but it still has a sense of we're overcoming something within us in order to do it. And I think it is that sensuality that says, well, there are things that would be easier to do, more comfortable to do, more fun to do.
I don't feel like doing
or
that.
I'm just going to go with my feelings instead of what I'm feeling, who I want to be. Instead of just what I feel like in a moment.
I don't feel like cleaning the house. I don't feel like mowing the lawn.
Right. So I think regardless of whether it's a discipline that's been inflicted upon us or one that we are taking on ourselves, there's an understanding that there's a certain hardship that's associated with it and a willingness to accept a hardship for a greater purpose.
Exactly. Accept a hardship for a greater purpose. Well said.
So if that's the definition we're going to be working with, the question I have for you is, why do we struggle so much with it?
Why do we? I mean, let's say original sin. Again, you mentioned sensuality, which you can always do. Vanity and sensuality always points back to pride. If I want the things the way they want them to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, why are we such creatures of comfort? Why do we seek comfort so badly? I don't know. Is that part of our concupiscence? Is that just part of our fallen nature? And why has it gotten so out of hand in today's culture? I'm just speaking of the United States in particular. And that is that when I was speaking earlier, other episodes about being so pagan, where anything goes. Like, discipline is almost a bad guy. Like, oh no, you need to live a more moral life. You need to, not fornicate with whomever you want to, or things like that.
I have a little bit of a theory on like the comfort side of things. I mean, there's an aspect of simply like pure like survival of the species that requires you to like strive for things that make you comfortable: food, shelter, clothing, water, things like that. In our society though, in America and other first world countries, we basically have all of those things taken care of for the most part. And so now what is the next thing to become comfortable in? And it's like this, seeking this like psychological comfort, this comfort of our feelings and emotions. And so I think that's why you see in our culture a lot of the turning away from shame, like shame's not a thing. Don't shame, blah, blah, blah. Turning away from sin's not a real thing. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we see a lot of that is because of this biological necessity to struggle to survive leads us to seek comfort. But then once we have those physical needs taken care of, we like just go even further.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you describe perfectly is the poverty of prosperity, which if you listen to the show, you've heard me bring that up from time to time, which I do believe that's what we're living in. That's why we have become such a pagan country. It's a poverty of prosperity where people don't have to work so hard, especially when you have a government, footing the bill for a lot of people to live.
I think that definitely plays into it. The reality is also, though, that in the past, when we were struggling to, have shelter, feed ourselves, that sort of thing, one of the things that was much more obvious to the human person was that we actually aren't in control of everything, and our strivings may not get it done. Like if you're in an agrarian society where you are relying,
can't make it rain.
Yeah, you can't make it rain. You can't stop the storm that destroys your crop. And so that reality that I am dependent on things that are beyond my own efforts to even survive was something that kept us ordered towards God. Because if we recognize our own inability to provide even for our most basic needs, we are going to seek one who has promised that he can do that and that he is in charge of that. And so as we became more prosperous, but less attached to the realities that we aren't in control of everything, we often will go towards a place of not feeling like we need God. And so when we don't feel like we need God, what then happens is our perspective is less eternal and more temporal. And now we've moved our attention from what this life is meant to be, which is the journey towards God, and making it the be all and end all of itself. So if we look at discipline as those hardships we're willing to endure in order to achieve a greater good, often when we're talking about it in the spiritual life, the greater good is eternal life. It's beyond this life. But if we're not focused on that, if we're not even acknowledging that that's what our purpose in life is, we won't see the good that the hardship could potentially bring, because we will have to endure a temporal pain, discomfort, or whatever for this future good. But if we don't recognize that future good, why would we do the temporal difficult thing now?
Which is the nature of sacrifice, right? That is what a sacrifice is. That's what Abraham was asked to do.
Yeah.
You know?
And that, I like that you brought up Abraham, because God promises something to him in the future. And he's asking him to do something very hard, very contrary to what everybody else would think was rational. And Noah,
or even
the
right.
same way. Yeah. Or Moses, the same way. God calls us out into these places of discomfort, but not just discomfort, of waiting, of not knowing how it's going to be accomplished. And the only way that we're going to be able and willing to endure that is if we trust God. So as we lose trust in God, we don't think that he actually has our good in mind, we're going to be less willing to step forward in these places where we're being called to do the hard thing. So I would say that one of the biggest reasons that we're in a place where we lack discipline and lack the willingness to endure discipline being endured upon us is because we have lost the perspective of this life not being the be all and end all, and that we're really striving towards something beyond it.
Right. Well, so I think, we talk about it on the cultural scale, which we're in much more need of that, but we can talk about it on the personal scale too, and how to increase that. I just wondered, it was such beautiful examples from, they say the greatest generation. And maybe it was because they had to endure a lot of hardships with the wars and sacrifice. It was like there was no choice. Like you said earlier, the farmers were dependent on the rain and so forth. But in the greatest generation, they had to make so many sacrifices just to survive. And I don't know, maybe God's got to take us to that point as a nation, as a country. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, you can kind of see this little downward spiral right now where life is getting more difficult. I mean, just look at your grocery bill, look at your gas bill, those kind of things.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it because, at the end of last episode, I talked about how we really need to be on guard against the spirit of despair. And these difficulties, these high prices, these uncertainty in the political system, uncertainty in the church, all these sort of things can lead us to be very discouraged and even despairing. But if we look at them as potentially the discipline that God is allowing, he's allowing a hardship, a less ease, a less comfort of feelings of security. And what is that meant to call us to? Because the Lord doesn't allow discipline if he's not trying to bring a good. So then we ask ourselves, okay, if there's something difficult in my life that the Lord is allowing, because nothing happens outside of his will. It may be his perfect will in some cases, but sometimes it's his permissive will. He allows us to endure the sins of others and the fallenness of the human existence. But why? Because he's trying to bring something good. So if we start asking that question, okay, what's the good he's trying to bring of this? And trusting that there is a good that he's trying to bring, then we become more open to the reality of receiving this discipline instead of trying to rail against it and oppose it and run away from it, which I think a lot of people in life are doing now. When hard things come in their life, they just want to, no, I will not have it. I'm running away from it. I'm going to do whatever I can to make it not so.
Yeah.
Do you think our hardships are different than people of the past? And let me explain what I mean. if the rains don't come and your crop fails, that's a very like a very tangible hardship that you can like see and touch and like understand.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas our hardships aren't that. Our hardships are different than that and maybe less easy to define.
Right.
Perhaps.
I will put one out there for you.
Yeah. Will you speak on that? What do you think about that?
Yeah. In particular, mental health issues. That's a real serious problem in our country, from schizophrenia to bipolar to depression to the rampant anxiety. So that's a less tangible type of suffering that, look in your families. Everyone knows someone that struggles with depression or anxiety. That's a real, less tangible, but nonetheless great suffering.
Yeah.
Well, I would also say that, we're speaking from the United States of America, that is a very blessed country that is, and there are still people suffering from poverty and lack of food and everything in this country. But in other countries where this is more of an issue, where there's great swaths of the population that are struggling for their daily subsistence, you actually do find less of that stuff. So I think that when you have more concrete realities of just life and death, you're going to tend to struggle less with these more existential kind of, difficulties.
The Israelites traveling through the wilderness for 40 years, the hardships that they were facing were very like tangible, physical hardships. And it was like, they're hungry and God is saying, do you trust that I'll feed you? Here is food. Whereas our hardships aren't, at least in our society, in our position in our society, our hardships and our struggles aren't that. The thing that God is testing us with is a little less obvious, I think, and less like bodily and it's more spiritual in nature.
Exactly.
And seems a little less easy to identify. It's not aching in your stomach because you're hungry. It's
Well, yeah,
it's aching in your soul.
I have a story that a priest told at a retreat one time that this just says this point perfectly. One of his first assignments was like at a Jesuit school, and he was wanting to be kind of more missionary, to be overseas and worked with the impoverished and so forth. And so he didn't get a chance to. He was kind of disappointed. He got in kind of a wealthy Jesuit school, and he was teaching there. And he worked with a particular young man who really struggled with depression and poor family life and things like that. And he really worked with him quite a lot over the year. And then he was actually got an assignment to go over to Africa to work in a missionary village. And he then befriended teaching, and he befriended a young man who was a complete orphan. He was by himself and had no parents, and he was 12, 13 years old, literally lived in a box on the side on a shore somewhere. And the young man living on the side of the shore in a box that was an orphan was very, very happy and very, very content. And during his time over in Africa with this young man, the young man back at the Jesuit school had committed suicide.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a perfect example of physical needs versus a mental type of anguish, and how I would argue in some ways it's worse. And it absolutely is worse.
There's something about it too that we're less. When Adam and Eve are living in perfect harmony with nature in the garden, outside of the garden, I believe, doesn't it say Cain? What did Cain go after he was cursed? Where did he go? Doesn't it say he goes and builds cities?
Yeah,
and so
I think there's something like that.
So there's something about we control our environment instead of accepting God's discipline for our lives and using that to orient ourselves to God even more so in every way of our lives. We like try to take control of our environment, and in taking control of our environment, it seems like we've become more and more divorced from the natural world, where we really set ourselves apart from the natural world. In a city, you can't even see the stars. Imagine what people 400 years ago would have seen looking up with no light pollution every night. The wonder that was just a sky full of stars, God's majesty every single night.
I'll be the first one. I'll be the first person to tell you that, losing our connection to nature and the beauty of the world has been a tremendous downfall for the human race.
And so don't you think that probably makes us less able to like see God in our daily lives, that we can't see him in nature as pervasively?
Huge factor. Huge factor.
And also, the heavens declare the glory of the Lord, right? And so they remind us of our good Father who's created a world for us. I mean, one of the things, whenever I'm looking at the sky, the thought that always comes into my mind and heart is, oh, our Lord has created such a beautiful nursery for his children. Look how he has decorated it, and this reality that it's those feelings, those thoughts that turn our hearts and minds to the Lord and remind us that he's our Father, that he has created this for us, and that he's working in this world to build us up into men and women of God instead of simply babies, children. If we're not reminded that we have a good Father, then when hardship comes our way, which is designed to be his discipline for us, to help us grow and mature.
And to choose him.
Right, and to choose him, we won't perceive it as such because we're not connected with the Father. And so we see these things as just tragedies or hardships or annoyances or things unto themselves that don't have the purpose which discipline has built into it. Because honestly, without the purpose of bringing about a good, discipline is just abuse. Right?
Right.
And so that's, I think, what we have started to see in life as hardship is just the abuse of the world or our circumstances, or even directly abuse from God, because we don't actually trust that he does desire our good and that he is allowing these things for a purpose that isn't just for our suffering.
Right. What's really coming to mind right now, thinking about the fall of civilizations, what led to these falls, right? Let's take Rome, for example. Once so powerful, so strong. But then, I read a novel series on life in Rome during that time. It was historical fiction. And the debauchery and it's similar to what we have today. It was absolutely awful, which says a lack of discipline, a lack of God, absolute lack of God. The paganism there is so great. And all the more reason that we have to, and maybe Christianity is not the only faith, I'm sure, but that brings in a type of discipline. Like I know the Muslims have that about, the bowing, or they stop and pray like 5 times a day.
Right.
That's an amazing discipline. We should try and adopt more disciplines in our Catholic faith.
Well, the reality
daily mass.
The history of the Catholic faith did have a lot of discipline in it, and over time, it's really diminished. And even just let's take the most simple thing. How long do you have to fast before Mass?
Right, 1 hour.
1 hour.
Is that really fasting?
It used to be you didn't eat, no matter what time you were having Mass, you didn't eat that day. And it had to at least be 12 hours, minimum 12 hours. That's why Mass was tend to be early in the morning
right?
because we didn't want to get eating some breakfast. Or just think about even something like moving days of obligation.
Yeah.
If they're on a Saturday, because God forbid we have to go to Mass 2 days in a row.
How about this one? And still in European countries, abstaining from meat on Fridays.
Yeah.
Still long-standing tradition,
right?
Always over there. That's a simple little thing we can do.
And truth be told, what we are responsible for is to still give up something on Friday, but how few people actually do abstain from anything on Friday.
In relaxing it by making it, you can do some sort of other penance. It's completely, most people don't even know.
Right, it's true.
Because they relax it. Instead of making it a hard and fast, simple rule, we made it more permissive to individual consciences. Mm-hmm. And in so doing, it just melted away.
Right. Like as a convert coming into the church, I didn't know until a priest from England had told me, "Oh no, over in Europe, we still fast every Friday. That's just a thing. It's just the United States, the conference has said that that's not necessary. And I had never heard of it, not taught it, anything. And we went through myself, I've struggled with, like, I went for a year or two fasting on Fridays and still just like keep up the momentum from Lent. But even then, it's like all of a sudden, I'm not doing it anymore. And it wasn't even like a conscious choice,
Right, yeah.
So it's a discipline.
It's not ingrained in our culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's a really important thing to remember, is that sometimes we think of discipline as being very individual, whereas God often works in a more corporate way.
Mm-hmm.
And the discipline of the church was meant to be shared and create a culture where we have this method of mutual support. Like one of the things that you were talking about, Caleb, as you're saying, like, well, if you're in a country where people are starving, that becomes, the more of the focus. And so we have less of these sort of emotional, psychological kind of things. But the reality is that it's a lot easier to acknowledge that you're starving together, as opposed to, well, I'm suffering from this anxiety or whatever. And that's not going to necessarily be shared in the same way. So it's isolating, but these things where we're in it together. And if we're in it together and you're feeling weak, then I'd be like, no, you can do it. I know you can do it. I'm here for you. And we get to be Simon for each other, helping each other carry our crosses. And then, so when the church backs down on her disciplines and makes things more permissive, she's actually not giving us something. She's stealing something from us. She's stealing from us a means in which we're meant to grow and mature, and also a means in which we're meant to help each other, to be present to each other, and to share the culture that feasts and fasts together. We're great at feasting together. We're okay. We're losing.
We could do better.
The discipline together.
Right. Yeah.
But how about, so that's a lot about what gets imposed upon us, but how about those things that we choose to do ourselves when we make choices to do hard things that no one's asking us to do, but we're doing it because we want to grow, we want to mature, we want to strengthen some part of our lives. What brings that about within us?
For me personally, I have to put it in the context of like prayer. That's a really great place to start for me, because over time, it's like you want to give God his due. I mean, I really did. I wanted to spend time with him. And so showing up every morning to pray, whether I felt like it or not, was a big thing for me, because, definitely a very sensuous person, and just, I want to sleep in. Oh, it's too late now. Oh, I have to hit the ground running. I don't have time. But especially after not really being able to do that very well while I was raising children, now it's a very prized time for me, and it still gets usurped away. But it's that discipline of giving God his due in whether I'm attending Mass, but especially with daily prayer, I do that because I love God, and I want to, like, that die to self. Because I feel like sometimes, you've got to really, obviously, sacrifice those things that you just want to do to give God his glory.
Mm-hmm. So what you've done there is you've identified the good that you're seeking, which gives you the motivation, the conviction to do the hard thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the thing that we if we want to step forward in taking on disciplines in life, it's important to do it in a mindful way and to understand, I'm not just doing this willy-nilly because it sounds cool or whatever. Like, sometimes, what is that Exodus 90?
Exodus 90.
I think some people will go into Exodus 90 type thing. And for those of you who don't know this, it's like a program that's for men, but I think they have a women's version now too, but has very, very strict disciplined things that you're meant to do or not do every day, like taking cold showers and abstaining from alcohol and, doing spiritual reading and all these sort of things. They're all great, beautiful. But I would say that if you're going into it simply because you want to see if you can do it, it's probably not a good recipe for success, because what you want to do when you go into something where you're choosing the hard thing is to clearly identify, why am I doing it and what good am I hoping to achieve from it?
Yeah.
I have a great example of that too, which I struggled with myself, which was fasting. Oh, I'm going to fast, and I bet you I'll lose some weight too. Oh, yeah, I'm really motivated by doing that fasting because I might lose some weight. And then, very quickly I realized, what are you doing? Don't add God to that fasting. You're just simply not eating then. So be honest.
One of the great things about Exodus 90 is that it's sort of designed in such a way that you are going to fail, and you're not doing it alone. I don't know. Do you know that about it?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah,
know
you're
that.
doing it. You have a group of guys that you're doing it with, and you meet weekly and discuss how things are going and how you failed and stuff. So part of the discipline there is falling and getting back up.
Yeah, that's
and building
great.
up that discipline
And being
of,
vulnerable to talk about it.
and being vulnerable to talk
Yeah.
about it and trying again, which kind of goes back to what I was saying in 2 episodes ago, is that struggling. Israel means to strive, to struggle with God, and to be that, to do that, to struggle with your faith, even when it's hard, especially when it's easy.
hard.
When it's easy too, I think, is to not become complacent, but to continue striving.
Yeah, we've loved to talk many times about, the verses from when Paul is talking about where he's asking the Lord to take the thorn from his side. And the Lord's like, no, I'm not going to, because my power is made perfect in your weakness. And so when we get to these places where we're willing to allow those little thorns, or we are, even taking them on willfully ourselves, why? So not just so that we can show our strength over something, so that we can say, look at me, how I endured this hard thing, but to put ourselves in a position where we are like, you know what, I'm going to reveal some vulnerabilities here. I'm going to show that in these places I might be weak, with the understanding that the Lord will make his power more evident in my life as I'm willing to expose my own weakness. So sometimes it's the failure to live up to the lofty goal of the discipline that's actually the best thing.
I'm so glad you said that. I've noticed that in my life too, that I would be so hard on myself for having fallen, and the result then later was, oh, happy fault, that thank you, Lord, for teaching me through this to go and sin no more, so to speak, in that particular thing. That's the last time, I'm going to fall like that. And so thank you for allowing it to make such an impression on me.
Yeah. One of the things I think might be good for us to chat about is if we're going to take on some disciplines, and, a lot of times the discipline that comes from the Lord, outside of us, we don't get any choice on it. We just have to accept what he metes out and have trust that he's working for our good. But if we're trying to decide that we want to take on some disciplines in order to grow in a certain area, or just mature in our spirituality, how we go about discerning what would be appropriate. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Can I start? Because
please start.
I have big time overdone it before. And
Confessions of an overdoer.
well, okay, so I decided that I was going to, and you love the Gabby After Hours YouTube channel, and I saw them talking about praying all 4 mysteries of the Rosary every day, and so I was like, I'm going to do that, and I did it for a long time, but then it got to the point where I was doing it to check a box, and it wasn't the devotion of it anymore. It was the checking the box of it, and then I scaled back from doing that because I was like, okay, well, this is too much. And I talked to a spiritual director about it. It was too much. And so I scaled back, but then it got to where it was hard to even pray 1 rosary of the day because I had scaled back maybe too much or something in it, because I'd made it too easy or something. I don't know, so you have to be careful not to bite off too much. I think that's a big part of it, because then it just becomes monotonous and box checking. And so I'd love to hear from y'all what your advice is on how to have healthy devotion and discipline that is meaningful and that you can stick with. When is it good to scale up? When is it good to scale down? And how do you discern that?
Well, I can talk to my personal experience. It's very good timing for me because I've been traveling a lot lately, helping my daughter with grandchildren or spending time with grandchildren. So my prayer life actually changes so much. So I have my little prayer spot at home, and I spend anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour and a half in my prayer spot. It just depends. And I'm different every day. I don't show up as the same person every day based on mood, tiredness, and my physicalness, what I've got going on. And so I've found that, number one, showing up every day religiously, like with that commitment, and having conversations with Christ. It could be as short as, Jesus, I love you today, and I'm really struggling. And as St. Therese has taught me, all I can do is get in the elevator. If I'm going to be lifted at all, if I'm going to elevate in any way, it's going to be only through Jesus. I mean, I've had days like that for sure. That's the one thing I do, but I'm showing up every day. So to me, it's showing up every day, and every day can look and may look different. It might not. It depends on season and time of life. When I'm with the grandkids, I do better with audio. Like, I'm taking care of my grandson who's only 4 months old. I may be listening to the 7 Sorrows of Mary and praying along with it. So it is malleable and it changes. It's fluid in a way, but it's consistent in that I'm showing up every day. Does that make sense? I say prayer oftentimes is a lot like the tide. Sometimes the tide is in and sometimes the tide is out, because that's part of our humanity. But the tide is always there. We're always showing up.
And I think, as a spiritual director, if somebody's bringing to me something that they're like, I think I'm going to do this, I want to explore with them how they came about that idea. Where did it come from? And what situation did it come from? Is there something they're hoping to accomplish through it? Because honestly, this all should be done with the Lord. This is not something like, well, I think this sounds like a great idea, or this podcast said it would be a great idea. It's like, discernment isn't discernment if it's done without the Lord. Mm-hmm. So, okay, you got that idea from, like, say, the podcast. You're like, okay, you got an idea from a podcast. Some reason that resonated with you. So let's talk about that. Like, why did it resonate with you? What does that mean to you? What do you feel like that's going to do in your life? Okay, now have you prayed with that? Yeah,
what I'm hearing is, what was the purity of your intention?
Yeah.
What was the intention? It sounds like you were like jazzed up, because this sounded like a fierce, kind of really masculine, grab the bull by the horns kind of thing, which is beautiful, but it had a season.
Yeah, and it was for a while. For a while, it was just like, it was really good. Mm-hmm. But then it just got to the point where, and I don't know where that shift happened either.
Yeah. And that's another point of discernment, because, like, if the God is calling you to something, a discipline, he will give you the grace to do it. But it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It just means that there'll be grace to do it. And they're often, especially at the beginning, if it's something he's calling to you to, he'll give you consolations. He'll give you that sense of, wow, I'm really feeling this. This is feeding me. This is doing great. I'm loving this. And then you might go through this period where he withdraws the consolations, but he's still calling you to it. He still ultimately has the grace for you to do it, but you're going to have to do it in such a way that it feels drier, or it feels...
This is where discipline comes in.
But you have to discern, is it that, or is it a season situation where he's like, we were good there, let's move on to something else. And so this idea of, like, we don't want to cling to anything, but then we also don't want to let it go so easily if it just becomes a little hard. And so, again, it's prayer, it's talking to the Lord about it, it's talking to a spiritual director about it, and just really taking these things seriously. Because I think sometimes what happens is that we get jazzed about stuff, but then we don't really properly discern it at the beginning, and then we drop it so easily because we never really discerned it, and therefore we're not committed to it. And so if you spend your spiritual life doing that too much, you're really not going to bear any fruit from discipline.
Yeah.
Because short-term discipline that doesn't really hurt at all, it's not really discipline.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is just the prudence behind those kind of decisions in your prayer, if you're going to take that on. Like, I have committed to take on now. And I've done it pretty well till recently. Things got out of busy, but to also pray the 7 sorrows of Mary, since if you listen to Red Sea Roundup, since talking to Monsignor Leonard, very beautiful devotion. And I think those things kind of add and build on each other according to time of life.
Sure. And before the show started, we were talking about, okay, what if you wanted to take on an even more like dramatic thing? And we did a whole show once a while back about bodily mortifications and things like that. You know, for some things like, you know, I'm going to take on a new prayer practice or something. You probably don't need a major input from somebody else to maybe step out into it and give it a go. But if you're thinking about something a little more dramatic, something like bodily mortifications, we were even talking about the kind of whipping of the back and things like that. Flagellation. That's the word I'm looking for. Thank you, Caleb. Historically in the church was actually called the discipline. And so if you're feeling called towards something like that, it really is very important to discuss it with a spiritual director or a priest or, you know, a very, very close spiritual friend, because what you're going to want to do is really, really get to purity of intention there. And if this is a call from the Lord, because these more out of the ordinary, maybe some could consider showy things, even if nobody's seeing it, but they're more of a temptation that the enemy can get in there and see like, oh, look how holy I am. Look at how like super cool and, you know, medieval I got on myself, you know, when the Lord is over there like, what are you doing?
Right.
Like, I didn't call you to that at all. You're just trying to make yourself look awesome to yourself. Right. And so to discern if that's really a call on your heart. And, you know, I will be honest, this is something that I have discerned with a spiritual director. And there were different seasons with it, and a time for a yes and a time for a no. And if the no comes and you push back really hard and you're like, well, this is what I feel called to do, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it. You know, that's a really good indicator that you're not properly disposed. If you have a person within you in your life who you have acknowledged as a spiritual director or a really close spiritual companion or whatever, and they're saying, you know, I really, really don't think this is a good idea, and you're like, well, too bad, I'm going to do it anyway. I think it's really a time to check yourself.
Right.
So we need to be open to being willing to discern and to be sensitive to the Spirit and how the Spirit's really speaking to us within our own hearts and through our brothers and sisters in Christ.
That's just a great transition onto our practical tips to leave the listeners with on this episode. The first thing I'm going to, for myself, this is going to be speaking like what I've learned from our podcast today. Let's take it that way, is the discipline that the Lord puts on me. And I'm going to really embrace a abandonment to divine providence. Like when difficulties come to pass, when there's maybe difficult personalities in my life or things like that, to try and embrace it more as a part of God's discipline to teach me patience, perseverance, kindness, and gentleness. And as far as me imposing a personal discipline on myself, I think that, you know, keep showing up to prayer in the morning. I would really like to have more during the day stuff. I'm not great at evening prayer. I haven't shown up for evening prayer on a regular basis, just kind of when I felt like it, because I get tired and that kind of thing. So I'm going to work on evening prayer. What about you?
What am I working on?
Yeah, like if from this episode, has it inspired you to take on any kind of like enhanced discipline and that you receive from the Lord or that you want to give to the Lord?
I think what it's really brought me to bear is not anything specific, but simply that this may be something that I should be bringing more regularly to prayer. Is there anything that you're calling to me to right now to either add or take away? You know, because sometimes discipline is adding something and sometimes it's depriving oneself of something. And so coming to that decision and just really being more attentive to this idea, because I know that I can grow in discipline in a lot of places. And in fact, when I was talking about in the last episode about trying to come at interactions with people and conversations with people with a greater spirit of humility, to take that pause to really say, I'm not going to jump in there with my opinion right immediately. That's actually a discipline that I'm currently working on. Mm-hmm. And I found myself doing things like saying, when somebody's talking about something and I have an opinion about it, or maybe a piece of advice or something, instead of just doing it, just saying it now, I'm taking a pause and I'm asking the person, I'm like, well, I had a thought, would you like me to speak into that? Or would you like to hear, my thought on this? And just kind of asking permission to speak into things. And so I'm currently working on that as a discipline, and it's a little bit awkward at times because I'm very quick to give my opinion. But it is bearing fruit, I think, because it's making me more thoughtful and more dwelling in this reality that just because I have an idea or an opinion that seems really good and true, it doesn't mean that it necessarily needs to be heard. So,
amen. That sounds.
How about you, Caleb?
I would say two things. One is I would recommend St. Thomas More's book, A Dialogue of Comfort Against Tribulation, which really talks into, speaks a lot about what tribulation, what hardship is, and makes the case that it is really an opportunity that God gives you to choose Him. And then the other one is I recently was asked to start doing a holy hour, an adoration, and maybe there's something with tying a discipline and a devotion to responsibility to others that could be really helpful, because sometimes it's easier to be more responsible to others than to ourselves. And so something like that could be really useful, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good idea. Well, I think we've covered it pretty well here. I do have a Bible verse that I want to leave us with, and this is from Hebrews 12:11. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. So let us be willing to receive and even inflict discipline upon ourselves with the faith and the trust that the Lord is tilling the soil of our souls to bear good fruit, most importantly, the fruit of righteousness. So help us to grow in that, O Lord. May we grow in your fruits of righteousness and be willing to undergo the rod of your discipline. Well, thanks all for listening, and we appreciate your disciplined, hopefully, tuning in to our podcast. We hope that you catch us each time we get a new episode. If you haven't gotten on the Red Sea Catholic Radio YouTube page, check it out, because we'll be there, and the new episodes go up there every time they come up, and we hope that you'll share it with anyone who you think would be blessed by it. And we will certainly be blessed by your tuning in next time. And until then, we hope you remain united with us in prayer. God bless.
God bless.